I was sitting before a black and white TV on January 1st, 1968. Evel Knievel was attempting to jump the fountains at Caesar's Palace. Later in January, my life flashed before me as I became a wanted man. Guys my age, 18 to 25, were being drafted to fight in Vietnam. I had 30 days to register for the military draft. I wasn't crazy about this whole idea. The war in Vietnam was not popular and didn't seem to make much sense. In addition to the protests in the U.S., 10,000 people in West Berlin kicked off the year by demonstrating against the U.S. fighting in Vietnam. The law was enforced at that time, so you had a good chance of going to jail for not registering for the draft. And selective services would look for you. Some protested this by burning their draft cards. The Cold War was a hot seat for guys like me. We grew up hearing adults talk about building fallout shelters for surviving a nuclear attack while the world was busy testing nuclear bombs. Now I was facing another bomb, napalm bombs, the type used in Vietnam. The Cold War fears of communism had taken us to a war in Vietnam, and here I was to graduate from high school, packing grocery bags on weekends to pay for college and ready to go. To college, not to war. I didn't want to kill or be killed in a war that made no sense. So the draft was naturally a hot topic for us. We talked about joining the National Guards. They didn't send the Guards to Vietnam, but getting into the Guards was near impossible. It was a popular idea. And we talked about conscientious objections, deferments, and sometimes we talked about moving to Canada. But these weren't the only cold or hot topics for us. It was probably cold in Wisconsin as we sat in front of our black and white TVs again, but warm in Miami, where the Green Bay Packers beat Oakland on January 14th for their second consecutive Super Bowl win. Green Bay had won the first ever Super Bowl in '67 and now again in '68. Shortly after that second win, Vince Lombardi resigned as coach of the Green Bay Packers. That was a cold spot for us Packer fans. Later in February, Richard Nixon announced his candidacy for president, as did Robert F. Kennedy in March. I remember being excited about Kennedy entering the race, but also half recall being concerned. Hatred and fear was bringing out the worst in some people. So the worst did happen. In April, and then again in June of '68. I don't recall exactly how I felt about the assassinations in '68. It was less of a surprise considering the past events, though. I remember exactly where I was, and the people around me from 5 years earlier when I heard that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I was in 8th grade. 2 years later, Malcolm X was killed. But now, in April of '68, a man dedicated to civil rights, human rights, and peaceful actions was shot and killed, Martin Luther King. And barely 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy was also shot and killed. He was John F. Kennedy's brother. Looking back, 1968 would appear to be a scary year. There was violence on the streets, actions for civil rights reform, anti-war demonstrations, and a Democratic convention in Chicago that was marked by violence and protest. So perhaps it was inevitable that a candidate focusing on the forgotten Americans or common people affected by civil rights, human rights, military draft, and looking for law and order would select him for president. Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States in November 1968. I think I voted for him. Perhaps it was a mistake. But the year went on, as I did, to my first year in college, In November, O.J. Simpson won the Heisman Trophy, and December, Arthur Ashe became the first black to be ranked #1 in tennis. I played tennis and enjoyed watching Arthur Ashe. He was also the first athlete to surprise me by having a heart attack in his prime. 11 years later, he was forced to retire from tennis. Most of the time, life in '68 was fairly normal, with positive events to offset the negative ones. The year was capped off with the U.S. circling the moon with the first manned spaceship. And looking back, however, these are the things that stuck in my mind from being 18 in '68. The endless war, the draft, assassinations, protests for human rights, music, hope for world peace, and the desire for change. The 60s, and '68 in particular, also set the stage for peace, love, and change. The largest music festival in the world, Summerfest, may have started in '68 in Milwaukee, but the most historic stage was to come. Many of the 500,000 people attending Woodstock the following year were impacted by these events and showing it. I look back with a little concern. I hope we haven't returned to elements of that time. Some of the fear and hatred seems to have moved from the streets to TV pundits. I'm beginning to feel a bit of what I felt in 1968, and I hope I'm wrong.